Okay, all right. I'm going to make another video about. I talked the other day in a video about this topic. Falling away, apostasy, and we're living in the time of the great apostasy. And I mentioned, different reasons why people do fall away from the faith, having been true believers. Okay, so that's possible, and I just talked about that in earlier videos today, and in another video along a while back about there's no eternal security, so you can fall away. But I don't think I emphasized enough about the difference between this. Okay, we have this difference right here when it comes to people who are leaving something. Okay, there are many people who don't leave the faith, but they leave the church, like the institutional church system. Okay, and that can be for very many different reasons. They're not falling away from the faith unless they leave the faith. Okay, they were a Christian and now they claim they're not a Christian, then they've left the faith. If they just leave the church, that's not leaving the faith. These are not the same thing. Okay, and I'm going to talk about many examples of this. Many times you can end up leaving the church because of your faith. Okay, so we see many churches are in apostasy, which means they embrace sin, false teachings, heresies, false religions, paganism, any of this stuff. They embrace this. They are in apostasy. If you're a true Christian who's walking uprightly, you can't fellowship with this. You can't be a part of that. And even if you're just not participating, but you're just sitting there, well, why would you sit there? How could you even sit there and not say anything, right? You would have to speak up and stand up and say something, speak out against that. And then you won't last very long there, right? So, like it says, you can't walk with somebody if you're not in fellowship together. There's no fellowship with this. So many people, because of their true faith, have left a false church. And it's very hard nowadays to find a church that isn't false, okay? If you do, it's rare, but this happens to so many people because this applies to so much of the visible church. Okay, so then you have something called church hurt or abuse. Churches are abusive in many ways, and that's another long list. People get hurt, they're wounded, and they leave the church. Okay, they don't leave their faith. Unfortunately, sometimes they do leave both, right? But sometimes they don't leave their faith, but they leave the church, the building, the institutional church because of this. Manipulation, abuse, people demanding money from them all the time, trying to get them to serve them, and whatever else they're doing to them. There might be a sexual thing or some form of abuse. And, of course, you should leave those situations, and you should even, take it to a legal level if something has happened in some other way, but like that, depending on what it is. But these are very valid reasons you should leave if these are going on. So, you know, people leave for all kinds of valid reasons. If you find a good church and everything's great, there's fellowship, it's biblical, it's all good, good. Go. But not everybody has that opportunity, that luxury. There may not be such a church in your area. You may not be able to get to one sometimes, even if there is. Maybe you don't have a car or some other thing. So anyway, there are all kinds of reasons why. Another one is the money. A lot of them, they want money, and if you can't give, they literally don't even want you there. They don't want the poor, they want the rich. And you just feel unwelcome, so you leave because it's not a business, but they make it into a business. And if you can't afford to pay the membership dues, you're not welcome in the club. That's how they run the thing. So many poor people leave over that. And tithing isn't biblical in the New Testament anyway. So this shouldn't be an issue, but for them, they make it into a business. So that makes it into an issue. Manipulating people for money. But anyway, they'll twist all the Bible verses. And again, it's not for the New Testament church, but you shouldn't be there anyway. But many people will feel shunned and ostracized if they can't. Well, even if they wanted to give, they couldn't. And so they feel unwelcome and they leave over that. So that's another reason. But anyway, many people leave church, but they don't leave the faith, okay, for any number of these kinds of valid reasons. But another issue is, so I just wanted to make that distinction, okay? Then you have, I'll talk about this first. You have the whole thing with cults. And I see a lot of this in videos where this is different, of course, they're in a cult, but they're in a cult for a while. Maybe they were raised in it. And then they see through the cult, they see the mind control, they see the manipulation, all kinds of this false stuff, false ideas, and they see through the cult and they leave the cult. But then, instead of coming to the true faith of Christianity, coming to Jesus, they just stay away from religion altogether. They become atheists. And it's from all the hurt and abuse that they have had from these cults. Unfortunately, that's another thing that will happen to them, is they're sort of made like they're closed off to anything now. It's good that they're out of false religion, but they won't come into the true religion of a relationship with Jesus. So, this is something else I see, and they're just really hardened. And it's just sad. I see videos by people like this on YouTube, and it's just sad. It's heartbreaking. So sometimes they do become Christians and, get saved, and some don't. So anyway, I just wanted to mention this. It's just part of it. There are all kinds of things going on out there. All right, but that's one more of them. So now, we have one more thing and it's actually a personal story, an experience I had. with the difference between church and churches. Okay, this was back when I was living down in Southern California, and I was in a bigger city, and I was hunting around everywhere for a decent church. Well, I went through a lot of places, and it was a really good experience when it comes to saw a lot of things, discovered, learned, all kinds of things about what's going on. It was sort of an investigation, an unintentional investigation. But anyway, one of the experiences I had was I found this one little church, and you never know. You start going, it looks fine, and then later you might find out, oh no, you leave. But anyway, I was there for a little while, and I was also involved in evangelism. I mean, this was a great place to do it. It was a large area of many, many people, lots of great spots to do evangelism. And sometimes I would link up with another group that did it, and some from anywhere, valid place, just a Christian evangelism setup, and I would just help and legitimate, the legitimate deal. And sometimes I did it on my own. And you just basically set up a table, maybe, or you just hand out little gospel papers. And if you have a table, you can have more information on there, and maybe even like a kind of a tent so there's shade, a couple of chairs, depending on the situation. So I started talking to, it was a pastor with a wife. So it was actually over email. I mean, everything seemed okay. And then I just emailed them. I just thought, well, I'm doing this alone. The more the better. And it was hard to find anybody who was interested in doing that. So, I would set up at a public park or by the beach or whatever. So I invited them to join me in that. I thought the more the better. And, a pastor should be interested, right? And his wife. So I mentioned it, and I, of course, had in mind, I already had the equipment, I had everything to do it. And it was flexible. There were different, I could use a bigger table or a smaller table, of course, but, it was all ready to go. And evangelism is sharing the gospel. You are advertising Jesus and the gospel, the faith, the Bible. That's it, okay? So anyway, I was talking about this whole operation, and then in an email, the pastor responded and said, oh yeah, I in fact was thinking of doing the same thing myself. Well, this is just great. Like, we can link up and join as a team and do this. And I responded, great, praise God. None of us, there are more of us working together. I don't like doing things alone like that. It's always better to more people, I've done it alone, but it's better with more. So I thought that solved both of our problems. And okay, great, I was looking forward to it. And then in the next email, he starts talking about all this stuff he was gonna, it was like stuff to advertise his church. And I'm sure, many people have seen this stuff. It might be a t-shirt, it could be a hat, it could be a mug, it could be a pen, a bunch of paraphernalia, right, to advertise their church. Like it's a brand name, and it's all about them building their little kingdom, okay? Once a person gets saved and they find a good church, great. I'm willing to help them get there. But that's not what evangelism is. It's not about advertising somebody's church. So, it's one thing if people do that separately, but that's not what this is. This, I said, it's evangelism and nothing else. Um, so then in the next email, I told him, I said, oh, well, this isn't about advertising any church, as a brand name or denomination, any specific location like this, let's say Grace Baptist Church or whatever, whatever it would be. It wasn't that, but whatever. It's just sharing the gospel, evangelism, just sharing Jesus. That's it, nothing else. And I made that clear. And I mean, it was my operation. I wasn't going to join with him otherwise in doing that. It had to be this way, or I'm not going to do it with anybody else at all. I'll just keep doing it by myself. So once I made that clear, and I was very nice and polite, I just made it clear it's going to be just the gospel and not advertising a church. And I never heard back. He wasn't interested anymore because it was just the gospel. It wasn't his church that he was trying to build and grow. I was like, wow, that's all they want. They're just advertising a business. They're not sharing the gospel. If it would have been just, if he would have been willing to do it, the way I said, just the gospel, and somebody would have, said, yes, I want to become a Christian, all that. And then they would, let's say he and they would start talking, and it would come up, oh, wow, yeah, he's a pastor, and he would invite them to that church. Fine, or, if, whatever, eventually, if they find a biblical church, great, any biblical church. But, okay, fine. But it was just like, even that wasn't enough. He wanted to advertise his church. And I was like, this isn't a church advertisement. It's a Jesus advertisement. It's the gospel. We share the gospel, and that's it. Like I said, it can go later in a conversation from there, but that's what's going to be on the banner. That's what's going to be on the paperwork. That's what's going to be advertised, and that's it. They accept it or not. And just the fact that, and that's how I kept doing it without him then, but just the fact that, after making that clear, he wasn't interested anymore. I was like, wow, And there were other things I could share about it, but I'll leave it at that. But I just saw, their real motive is something else. So anyway, but that shows the clear distinction between growing the church, which is Jesus's body, and growing their church, some pastor's personal little church business kingdom empire. Okay, that's the difference. If they're not interested in evangelizing with the true gospel, they're not interested in the church, period. Okay, they're just interested in their little business. That's it. So anyway, these are just some of the differences here, about the whole things that go by the name church, So anyway, that's all this video is. I just wanted to add a few little details there. Okay. That's it, I think, for today. All right. Have a blessed rest of your day, and I'll be back next time.